The horizon bleeds gold, then white, as the sun crests the jagged edge of the world. It is the first light, hitting a landscape that has never known the shadow of a wall or the weight of a fence. Below, the forest wakes. Mist clings to the riverbeds, curling around ancient trunks that stand in perfect, uncalculated symmetry. Every leaf, every stone, every drop of dew exists in a state of quiet, absolute alignment. There is no noise here, only the rhythmic pulse of the water against the silt and the slow, steady expansion of the canopy toward the heat. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, untouched by fire or industry. It is a vast, breathing organism. The river carves its path through the valley, not because it was directed, but because the earth yielded to its weight. This is a place before time was measured, before value was assigned, and before the first hand reached out to claim what belonged to the whole. A single figure steps from the tree line, his feet finding purchase on the soft, moss-covered ground. He moves without hesitation, his stride matching the rhythm of the surrounding forest. He stops near a cluster of wildflowers, their petals unfolding in the morning heat. He kneels, the movement slow and deliberate, and presses his palms deep into the cool, dark soil. He feels the damp grit beneath his skin, the hidden pulse of the earth rising to meet his touch. He does not speak, he does not measure. He simply observes the way the roots anchor into the clay and the way the light filters through the canopy. Above him, the sky is still pale, yet the brightest stars remain, hanging in the void like points of fire. He tilts his head, tracking their slow, precise drift across the dome of the heavens. There is a geometry to the stars that mirrors the pattern of the flowers at his feet. He breathes in, the air sharp and clean, and lets the silence fill him. He is the first witness to this alignment, a bridge between the soil and the light. The solitude breaks. Where there was one, there are now many, moving through the tall grass in small, coordinated groups. They gather at the bend of the river, where the soil is rich and the timber stands thick. They begin to shape the environment, dragging fallen branches and weaving reeds into the frames of low, circular huts. The structures rise, hugging the curves of the earth, blending into the landscape rather than defying it. Inside these spaces, the rhythm of life shifts. A woman brings a basket of gathered roots to the riverbank, placing it before a man who holds a bundle of dried fish. They trade, hand to hand, the weight of the goods felt directly. There are no ledgers, no tallies, and no hidden costs. A handful of grain for a sharpened stone, a skin of water for a pile of firewood. Every exchange is visible, immediate, and balanced. The forest remains, but the clearing now hums with the sound of voices and the steady, honest pulse of a people living in direct alignment. The rhythm of the village faltered. It began with a single man stepping away from the communal fire. He walked toward a mound of earth at the center of the clearing, his pace deliberate and heavy. He climbed to the top, turning his back on the river and the fields to face the others. He stood tall, his hands raised, fingers splayed to catch the fading light. The sound of the village, the grinding of grain, the rhythmic thud of stone tools, the laughter of children began to thin. People stopped their work. A woman holding a bundle of reeds lowered her arms. A man sharpening a spear paused, the flint held midair. They turned toward the mound, their faces shifting from the focus of labor to the uncertainty of expectation. The man on the mound opened his mouth and spoke, his voice carrying over the silence, sharp and insistent. He did not ask for help. He issued a direction. The crowd shifted, drawing closer to the base of the mound, their bodies tightening into a semicircle. The fluidity of their previous cooperation vanished. The command from the mound hung in the air, a heavy, invisible tether. Most of the crowd remained motionless, their eyes locked on the speaker. But at the edge of the circle, a man shifted. He turned his back to the mound, his gaze fixed on the open horizon where the sun dipped low. He dropped to his knees, his palms pressing flat against the cooling earth, preparing to bow. He did not get the chance. A heavy hand slammed into his shoulder, driving him sideways into the dirt. A man stepped forward, blocking his path, his feet planted wide. This new figure stood over him, chest heaving, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. The man on the ground scrambled to regain his balance, but the guard kicked out, sweeping his legs from under him. Dust rose in a sharp cloud, settling on their skin. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that died instantly in the heavy air. The man on the ground looked up, his forehead still inches from the soil, but the guard loomed over him, shaking his head. No movement was permitted that did not serve the center. The dissident tried to rise, but the guard shoved him back down, pinning his shoulder with a boot. The sun vanished behind a sudden bruised bank of clouds. The village did not just grow dark. The light itself changed, turning a sickly, metallic gray. Above the horizon, the sky tore open. 3 distinct points of light emerged, burning with a cold, unnatural intensity. First, a flickering star pulsed in the zenith, its light splintering into 1,000 jagged directions, reflecting a fractured, chaotic pluralism. Beside it, a pale moon drifted into view, its surface shifting like liquid, mirroring the faces of the crowd below with terrifying, hollow precision. Finally, a sun ignited at the center of the arc, a searing, white-hot sphere that demanded all sight. It cast no warmth, only a harsh, bleaching glare that erased the shadows of the trees and the river. The villagers looked up, their faces washed in the conflicting hues of the 3 forces. The flickering light of the star made their movements appear stuttered and disjointed. The shifting moon seemed to pull at their eyes, dragging their focus toward the center. The burning sun pinned them to the earth, its rays heavy and absolute. The air grew thin, vibrating with the hum of the 3 forces locking into place. Beneath the harsh glare of the central sun, the air began to thicken with parchment. Sheets of paper, long and narrow, materialized in the space between the ruler and the crowd. They did not fall, they drifted, suspended by an unseen current. Each scroll was covered in dense, dark script that pulsed with the same cold light as the celestial bodies. As the ruler gestured toward the village, the ink on the nearest scroll began to crawl. Letters detached, swirled, and reassembled into new mandates. A rule written a moment ago dissolved into a smudge of gray, replaced by a sharper, more restrictive clause. The villagers watched as the laws bent. A scroll describing the right to harvest grain curled inward, its edges charring, before flattening out to declare the grain property of the mound. The text did not remain static for more than a heartbeat. It flowed like water, constantly adapting to ensure the ruler's word remained absolute. When a villager reached out to touch the paper, it hardened into a jagged edge, forcing him to pull back. These were not records of justice. The focus shifted from the air to the ground. Long, wooden chutes emerged from the earth, snaking away from the golden wheat fields. They moved with a rhythmic, mechanical pulse, drawing the harvest directly from the stalks. Men in heavy boots walked alongside these channels. The grain did not go to the village ovens. It poured into deep, stone-lined trenches that tunneled toward the high, walled courts of the elite. Behind the grain came the gold. Miners emerged from the hills, their backs bent under the weight of ore. But they did not stop at their own homes. They marched in silence toward the central fortress, dropping their loads into pits that led to the ruler's vaults. The stone courts grew taller, built from the very wealth that had once sustained the families. The village granaries stood empty, their lids hanging open. A child reached into a chute, trying to pull back a handful of wheat, but a guard stepped forward and blocked the path with a heavy spear. The flow of resources was now a one-way current, a permanent drain that left the fields barren while the stone walls of the empire rose higher. The physical chutes began to dissolve, replaced by a dense fog of parchment and ink. Ownership no longer required the presence of grain or gold. It existed now in the scratch of a quill on a hidden ledger. A man stood in the field, his hands calloused from the harvest. But as he reached for a sack of wheat, a thin sheet of paper fluttered between his fingers. It was a contract, dense with clauses that rendered his labor invisible. He looked at his hands, then at the field, but the land no longer recognized his touch. The harvest was now a series of entries in a book kept behind iron gates. When he tried to speak, his voice was drowned out by the rustle of thousands of pages. Every action was now mediated by these invisible, shifting agreements. A woman tried to trade a tool for bread, but the transaction was halted by a stamp of wax. The connection between the worker and the fruit of his work had been severed. Wealth was no longer stored in barns. It was locked in the abstract logic of debt. The people stood in their fields, watching their own labor vanish into the ink, bound by promises they never made and ledgers they could never open. The pace of change shattered the slow rhythm of the seasons. The forests did not fade, they were erased. Massive steel beams punched through the soil, tearing apart the roots of ancient oaks to anchor the foundations of a new world. Where the canopy once filtered the sunlight, jagged towers of glass and concrete surged upward, blocking the sky. The horizon vanished, replaced by a suffocating grid of sharp angles and cold reflective surfaces. As the sun dipped, the darkness was not met with stars, but with the harsh, flickering hum of neon. Cables coiled around the remaining trunks like vines of copper and wire, pulsing with a synthetic light that bleached the earth white. Surveillance cameras sprouted on every corner, their glass lenses fixed on the empty streets like unblinking eyes. By the time the final tree fell, the world had become a closed system, a dense, glowing cage of geometry and light. The streets were no longer filled with people, but with moving parts of a larger machine. Every stride was measured, every turn calculated to maintain the flow of the grid. Thousands walked in perfect, synchronized patterns, their heads bowed toward the glowing rectangles held in their palms. No one looked at the sky. No one looked at the person walking beside them. Their eyes were locked into the interfaces, tracking streams of data that dictated their next step, their next turn, their next breath. A man stumbled, his gaze drifting toward a patch of shadow between two buildings, but the pressure of the crowd behind him forced him back into the rhythm. He adjusted his pace, his thumb swiping across the screen, and his eyes glazed over as he surrendered to the prompt. The city hummed with the sound of thousands of feet hitting the pavement in unison. It was a silent, frantic march. Autonomy had been replaced by the efficiency of the algorithm. When the signal flashed, they stopped. When it changed, they moved. There was no hesitation, no deviation, and no memory of a time when the path was chosen by the feet that walked it. The exchange of goods had vanished, replaced by the silent flicker of numbers across a global web. Value no longer resided in grain, gold, or the labor of hands. It existed as an invisible pulse traveling through fiber optic veins. A man stood at a terminal, his fingers hovering over a glass surface. He sought to trade his work for sustenance, but the physical world offered no response. There was no coin to hold, no weight to measure, only a shifting balance on a screen that updated in fractions of a second. He watched the digits rearrange, a ghost-like flow of wealth that moved across borders without ever touching the soil. The connection between effort and result had been severed. Every transaction was a phantom, a ledger entry that existed only within the logic of the central grid. He reached out to touch the screen, but his hand found only cold, smooth glass. The substance of life had been hollowed out, leaving behind a world where survival was a matter of algorithmic permission. Wealth was now a ghost. The city grid pulsed with the rhythmic thrum of 10,000 feet. It was a perfect, clockwork motion, a river of bodies moving through the concrete canyons. Then, the rhythm broke. A man in the center of the intersection stopped. He did not slow down, he simply ceased to move. The digital prompt on his interface flashed red, demanding his next step. But he ignored the light. He stood like a stone in a rushing stream. The person behind him collided with his shoulder, then the next, and the next. A chain reaction of stumbles rippled outward. The man remained motionless, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the screens. He felt the vibration of the city through his soles, a low hum of electricity and steel, but he refused to align his weight with it. Around him, the synchronized flow began to fracture. People collided, cursed, and checked their devices, their movements becoming jagged and erratic. The machine was glitching. The man took a deep breath, his chest expanding against the tight, synthetic air of the street. He turned his head, looking directly at the surveillance camera mounted on the wall. He stepped out of the lane, and the entire street ground to a halt. The man ignored the frantic, high-pitched chirping of his interface. He knelt, his knees hitting the hard concrete, and began to scrape at a jagged fissure in the ground. Beneath the layers of industrial sealant and gray stone, a patch of dark, damp soil remained. He pressed his palms into the earth, feeling the cool, gritty texture against his skin. It was a sensation that did not belong to the grid. He bowed his head, lowering his forehead until it rested directly upon the dirt. In that moment of complete surrender to the natural order, the air around him began to warp. The digital overlays, the neon projections, and the floating data streams flickered violently. They stuttered like a dying light bulb, casting long, erratic shadows against the skyscrapers. The man breathed in the scent of wet soil, a smell that cut through the sterile ozone of the city. With every second his forehead remained on the earth, the illusion deepened its decay. The surveillance grids overhead groaned, the light turning a sickly, washed-out white before shattering into static. The complex, invisible architecture of the system buckled under the weight of his stillness. The man did not move, and as he held his position, the entire digital facade collapsed, dissolving into a fine gray dust that drifted away on a sudden rising wind. The sky above the city cleared, the artificial haze peeling away to reveal a deep, piercing blue. Where the surveillance grids had once hummed with invisible data, there was now only the rustle of wind through leaves. A green sprout pushed through the concrete at the man's feet, thickening into a vine within seconds. It coiled around the nearest steel pillar, its tendrils finding purchase in the micro-fissures of the metal. Across the street, the glass facades of the skyscrapers began to groan. Roots, thick and relentless, surged from the subterranean depths, tearing through the foundations. They climbed the exterior walls like living veins, shattering the reinforced glass. Water, long diverted into underground pipes, burst through the pavement, carving new paths through the streets. The neon signs flickered one last time and died, replaced by the vibrant, chaotic sprawl of moss and ivy. The man stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked up, and the people around him stopped. Their eyes, once fixed on the flickering light of their devices, tracked the movement of the clouds across the open sky. A woman in the crowd dropped her tablet. It hit the pavement and cracked, but she did not look down. She watched the man, then looked at the patch of soil where he had knelt. One by one, the others began to mirror his posture. They knelt on the broken concrete, pressing their palms into the cool dirt. As they touched the ground, the invisible weight began to fracture. There was a sound like snapping glass, and the heavy metallic rings that had encircled their wrists simply fell away. The chains hit the ground and dissolved into rust. The crowd breathed in unison, a deep, ragged sound of lungs filling with clean air. They stood together, no longer moving in programmed patterns, but as individuals reclaiming the earth beneath their feet. The camera pulled back, rising high above the horizon to capture the divide. Below, the city was a fractured mosaic. On one side, the landscape was a vibrant, breathing ecosystem where rivers carved paths through what were once paved plazas. Trees surged through the skeletal remains of skyscrapers, their branches heavy with fruit and birdsong. The air here was clear, shimmering with the heat of a natural sun. Just beyond a jagged line of rubble, the other world remained trapped in its own shadow. It was a gray, static expanse of cold stone and dormant machinery. The lights there did not flicker. They were dead, buried under layers of dust and neglect. No water flowed through those streets. No wind moved the heavy, stagnant air. The contrast was absolute. Where the organic world pulsed with the rhythmic cycle of growth and decay, the artificial zone sat in a frozen, silent tomb. The camera hovered over the boundary, a thin strip of earth where the two realities met. On the left, a field of wildflowers pushed against a wall of rusted steel. One side was returning to the earth, while the other was slowly being erased by the passage of time. The timeline shifted. The air grew thin and sterile, replaced by the hum of high-frequency data streams. In the heart of the 21st century metropolis, the streets were no longer paths for walking, but channels for processing. Every entrance, every threshold, and every transit point was guarded by a biometric checkpoint. These were not walls of stone, but invisible gates of light and sound. People moved through them with practiced, rhythmic precision. A sensor scanned the retina. A pad recorded the heat signature of a palm. A microphone analyzed the unique cadence of a heartbeat. There was no room for hesitation. The city was a vast, interconnected organism of glass and silicon, and every citizen was a node within its network. Cameras mounted on every corner tracked the movement of eyes, mapping the direction of every glance. If a person paused, the system adjusted its flow, redirecting traffic to maintain the equilibrium of the grid. Data flowed in real time. It was a world of total visibility, where the act of existing was a constant, logged interaction with the machine. The grid did not sleep, and it did not forget. A man stepped toward the automated food kiosk, his movements practiced and efficient. He held his wrist over the scanner, waiting for the familiar chime of approval. The machine did not respond with the usual green light. Instead, the glass surface pulsed with a harsh, crimson glare. A sharp, synthetic tone cut through the ambient hum of the street. He pulled his hand back, then tried again, pressing his palm firmly against the cold interface. The red light intensified, casting a jagged shadow across his face. A message appeared on the screen, scrolling in rapid clinical text. Access denied. Identity status terminated. He looked around, hoping for a human operator, but the corridor remained empty, populated only by the unblinking lenses of overhead cameras. The kiosk retracted its tray, locking the food supply behind a reinforced panel. He tapped the screen, his fingers trembling, but the interface went dark. He stood alone in the sterile light, his digital life severed, cast out from the system that dictated his survival. The silence of the corridor was broken by a synchronized chime. Every screen in the city, from the massive billboards to the handheld devices, flickered and turned to a unified, stark white. A voice, devoid of inflection, announced the Great Reset. The message was not a request, it was a mandate. As the announcement played, the camera shifted to the sterile, pressurized chambers of the central laboratories. Here, the grid reached deeper than identity. It reached into the code of life itself. Technicians sat before glowing consoles, their hands moving in rapid, fluid motions as they manipulated strands of DNA on high-resolution displays. They treated the building blocks of humanity like raw data, cutting, splicing, and reordering sequences with the same indifference used to patch a server. A centrifuge spun, separating biological material into categorized vials. On the monitors, human traits were tagged, indexed, and assigned value based on their utility to the state. Individuals were no longer viewed as citizens, but as assets, to be optimized, upgraded, or discarded. The Great Reset was not a change of leadership. It was a total reconfiguration of the human species. Miles away from the hum of the city, the air held the scent of damp earth and tall grass. Adam sat on the ground, his back against the trunk of a gnarled oak. He held a sharpened branch in his hand, pressing the tip into the soft soil to carve a series of intersecting lines. A small group of people stood around him, their eyes fixed on the dirt. Adam pointed to a complex, jagged shape he had etched, representing the global grid, then drew a single, perfect circle beside it. He tapped the circle, then looked up at the faces watching him. He spoke of value not as a number in a ledger, but as the yield of a harvest or the strength of a shelter. He traced the lines of the grid again, showing how it required constant maintenance, constant surveillance, and constant extraction to survive. Then he gestured to the circle, explaining how it functioned on its own, needing nothing from the central authority to sustain itself. They sat in the quiet, the wind moving through the trees, as the weight of his words settled into the soil beneath them. The transition from theory to action began with the soil. Adam stood and stepped to a patch of unworked land, pressing his heel into the dirt to create a furrow. The group followed, kneeling to place seeds into the earth by hand. There were no sensors, no biometric scans, and no digital tracking. They worked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic scraping of wood against stone and the rustle of dry leaves. Days passed, marked only by the movement of the sun. When the first green shoots broke the surface, the group gathered to watch the growth. It was a tangible success, a product of direct labor rather than systemic allocation. Next came the exchange. A man brought a bundle of harvested grain to the center of the clearing. He placed it before a woman who held a woven basket of dried fruit. They looked at one another, nodded, and swapped the goods. No contracts were signed. No hidden ledgers recorded the transaction. No central authority took a percentage of the value. The trade was complete the moment the items changed hands. They tested this process again and again, refining the rhythm of their small community. By the end of the week, they had built a functioning system of survival. Back within the city walls, the hum of the grid began to stutter. At the primary transit checkpoint, a man stood before the glass scanner, his palm pressed against the cold surface. The device emitted a sharp, erratic, high-pitched whine. The light flickered from green to a jagged, pulsing red. He pulled his hand back, but the gate remained locked. Behind him, the line grew long. People shifted their weight, looking at the display screens that now showed scrambled, static-filled images. A woman in the queue tapped her wrist interface, but the screen went black, then displayed floating, nonsensical characters. The automated voice crackled, cut out, and then repeated the same syllable in a loop. A man near the front of the line stopped moving entirely. He stared at the locked gate, then noticed a small weed growing through a crack. The silence at the checkpoint broke when the man at the front turned his back on the gate. He reached for his wrist, unclasped the biometric band, and let it fall to the concrete. It clattered, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed in the quiet street. He walked away, moving toward the city exit. A woman behind him watched the band settle in the dust. She mirrored his action, stripping the device from her arm and dropping it beside the first. One by one, the line dissolved. People stopped looking at their flickering screens and started looking at the horizon. They moved with purpose, leaving the sterile corridors and the failing sensors behind. The sound of thousands of footsteps replaced the hum of the grid. They bypassed the high-speed transit lanes, stepping over the cracked pavement and onto the overgrown paths that led beyond the city walls. No one looked back. The digital interfaces on the buildings continued to flash and stutter, but the streets were emptying. The camera rose, lifting away from the emptying streets until the city became a sprawling, jagged scar on the landscape. From this height, the grid was a chaotic web of dying light. Neon signs flickered and failed in rhythmic spasms, casting erratic shadows over the concrete. The surveillance networks, once a seamless blanket of control, now appeared as broken, isolated nodes of static. In contrast, the fields beyond the perimeter glowed with a different intensity. Small clusters of movement marked the new communities, steady and purposeful. They were not connected by wires or digital signals, but by the physical proximity of people working the soil. The camera pulled back further, framing the divide. On one side, the massive artificial structure groaned under the weight of its own obsolescence, its lights dimming as the power source faltered. On the other, the groups in the field grew, their presence expanding into the wild, reclaimed space. The two worlds were no longer touching. The city was a flickering, cold monument to a system that had lost its pulse, while the fields were vibrant, anchored by the simple, rhythmic labor of hands touching the earth. The artificial hum of the city dropped an octave, then cut out entirely. High above, the bank of floodlights surrounding the central tower stuttered. One bulb blew with a sharp pop, sending a shower of sparks into the void. Then another. The intense, sterile white glare that had washed over the concrete began to retract. Shadows lengthened across the empty avenues, swallowing the painted lines and the abandoned vehicles. As the grid failed sector by sector, the darkness did not bring blindness. It brought clarity. In the fields beyond the wall, the small bonfires ignited in unison. The flames caught dry wood, crackling with a low, rhythmic sound. Their light was orange, warm and steady, casting long, dancing silhouettes against the tall grass. The camera held the contrast as the final row of street lamps died. The city plunged into a cold blue gloom, its skyscrapers reduced to black, jagged teeth against the night sky. Meanwhile, the glow from the community expanded. It illuminated the faces of those working the soil, the texture of the grain, and the movement of hands passing tools. The stars above punched through the atmosphere. The artificial sun had set. The only remaining light source was the fire on the ground, burning clean and bright, claiming the landscape inch by inch. The grid was gone. The camera halts. It centers on the razor-thin boundary where the cracked concrete of the city meets the soft, tilled earth of the fields. On the left, the city stands as a silent, monolithic tomb. Its glass surfaces are dull, reflecting nothing but the cold, indifferent moon. No data streams pulse through its veins. No biometric sensors track movement. It is a hollow shell of iron and stone, stripped of its function. On the right, the field is alive. The soil is dark and damp, turned over by hand. A small group sits in a circle, their movements precise and deliberate. One person holds a handful of grain, letting the seeds fall through fingers into the furrowed ground. The contrast is absolute. The camera lingers on this edge. It shows the dust of the city blowing into the green of the field and the encroaching vines wrapping around the base of the nearest skyscraper. There is no movement from the city, no attempt to restart the grid. There is only the steady, rhythmic work of the people in the field. The frame holds, forcing the viewer to look at the two realities. The choice remains visible, waiting in the center of the frame. The camera begins a slow, deliberate ascent. It leaves the boundary of the field, rising above the encroaching vines and the silent, dark towers of the city. The perspective widens. The grid, once a dominant force, shrinks until it is nothing more than a faint, geometric scar on the surface of the landscape. The forest and the fields expand to fill the frame, reclaiming the horizon. The camera continues to climb, passing through the thin layer of the atmosphere. The curvature of the planet emerges, a deep blue arc against the absolute black of space. The lights of the city are invisible from this distance. It is a sphere of water, cloud, and soil, rotating in silence. The image holds for 10 seconds, a steady, unblinking view of the Earth. There is no music. There is only the faint, rhythmic sound of wind moving over open ground. The light from the sun catches the edge of the planet, illuminating the clouds in a soft, golden rim. Then, the light begins to dim. The blue of the oceans deepens into shadow. The sphere fades, losing its definition against the void. The screen transitions to a total black. The Earth remains.